Well, g'day viewers. This month's installment is on migrating data to SQL Server. We're going to go through a really quick overview of the planning process, and then we can go into deep dives about whichever bits we want to talk more about. So I'm going to give you a quick overview. Well, obviously, the first thing you need to do is install SQL Server somewhere. If you're a little business, you might want to put it on a PC on a peer-to-peer network. If you've got a server, then you probably want to get your IT people to install SQL Server there. You can always go for an Azure in the cloud type thing. Trying to figure out the costing of that's a bit difficult. AWS will now host a SQL Server for you. Or you could even use an Azure VM and host SQL Express on that. So the additions of SQL Server you can get, the one that I mostly deal with is SQL Server Express, which is free, and not just free from cost, but free from having to deal with all of the licensing complications that come with standard or enterprise. In which case, if you're using those ladders, you can use more than one core of your processor, but the licensing gets all a bit complicated. It's a good idea to get your IT department involved. And as we all know, IT departments don't like dealing with Access databases because they don't have control over them. But as soon as you say, we're going to have a SQL Server database, they get all excited and start trying to help you. With your security, you've got two flavors mostly. You've got SQL Server authentication, where you're going to pass a username and a password when you connect, or we can just use Windows authentication. And if your IT people are really good, they can get that all coordinated with Active Directory and set up groups for your SQL Server authentication, and it all gets really easy. There are a couple of things that you've got to get right when you first install your instance of SQL Server, and bearing in mind you can install more than one instance on a particular device, but it's a lot simpler if you just have one default instance, and it's going to use the default port, which is 1433, and you don't have to specify that with connection strings and what have you. And one thing you need to get right is your collation. If you don't get collation right, sometimes you've got to start again, because collation is very difficult to change. And collation is the method that SQL Server uses to sort text. And depending on what language you use, if you only use English, then something like SQL, Latin, what have you, might be okay for you. But if you've got to deal with other languages, then you need to do a bit more research. Right, it's important to set up your environments. Obviously, you've got a production environment that everyone works in. You need a test environment, and you need a development environment. It's important to make sure your development environment is not connected in any way with your test or production environment, as in your development machines cannot access the same SQL Server instance as those other two machines. In your development environment, you can use the developer edition of SQL Server, for example, which is free, but you can only use it for development. But when you develop, you're working against that. And then when you move the front end into the test environment, everything has to be relinked. And you'll know if something hasn't been relinked because it won't work. The problem, if you've got the development environment able to connect to the instance in production or test, something may not relink, and in development, you're accidentally working on production data, or when you move to test or production, something isn't relinked. So it's important to make sure that's separate. Now, the first part of your migration then, having set all that up, is the migration of your schema. Now, this is one thing where SSMA, SQL Server Migration Assistant, can be really useful if you're only doing, one or two. SQL Server Migration Assistant will connect to your Access database and your SQL Server database and translate all of the tables and indexes and what have you, well, hopefully all, that are in your Access database into SQL Server. But having done that, you want to have a really good review of the data structures you've ended up in within SQL Server, and you want to fix up any issues that aren't quite right, like you haven't got foreign keys where you should, and you haven't got the right indexes and all that sort of stuff. So now's the time to get into your SQL Server, and you can just do it through Management Studio, or you can use T-SQL scripts or whatever, we'll talk about that later, to actually get all your data structures right before you start to move the data. Now, the important thing to remember with your data migration is that the whole process has to be repeatable. You're going to do this more than once. It's not like you can say, hey, everybody stop work while we migrate to SQL Server over the next 2 or 3 days. No, it's got to be, you hit a button and it all just happens. And to do that, you have to set up a system whereby you've got queries that delete all the data in SQL Server. Then you've got a query that will, for each table in your Access database, that imports the data from that table, and they're just a bulk insert query. And you run those in hierarchical order. So, for example, you've got to do customer before you can do invoice, etc. And before you do queries, if there's any dodgy data, they're going to fall over and give you a not very descriptive error message and not tell you very much about what the problem was. In which case, I usually revert to a row by laborious row methodology, but I actually call those same queries one record at a time until I find the records that are giving me a problem, and then I fix the data in the source, and I just keep doing this until I've got to the point where I can run the queries that delete all the data, run the queries that migrate the data, and it all just happens in one motion. That's my aim. Okay, so the next thing we need to talk about is somewhere between the schema migration and the data migration, we need to do some work on our application. And there's going to be a couple of things that are going to be different about our front-end application to work with SQL Server. Now, in the initial migration, let's not even talk about pass-through queries and stored procedures and views. Let's just relink the tables and get the application working on that basic level before we start doing things that are going to start improving our performance, like using stored procedures and views and what have you. So a couple of those things that are going to hit you in the application that you need to deal with. DAO record sets and execute queries need to use the DBC changes, and that can actually be applied before you even move to SQL Server, because the DBC changes will still work with an Access database. It's just, if you don't have them, they won't work with SQL Server. The other main consideration, and this isn't the only, but it's the other main one, is that auto numbers work a little bit differently, in that when you first insert or add a record in Access, it creates the new primary key at the point of inserting the record, whereas SQL Server doesn't create that ID until you actually update the record. So that's going to mean some slightly different ways of retrieving new primary keys if you're, for example, using the add new method in a DAO record set. So that's a bit of a brief overview. And now we could get into the nitty-gritty and the deep stuff. And at this point, anyone who's had any experience can chime in. Anyone who's got any questions, go for it.
May I just have a very quick thing with you're talking about auto numbers. I think we probably all understood what you said, but it wasn't entirely clear, in as much as with Access, it doesn't when the record's inserted, it's when the buffer is dirtied. So if you have a form where any change is made to that record, even if it's not actually saved, if it's a change is made to the record, the new record, then an auto number is created for you.
Correct. So even if you hit escape, that auto number's been used. But as soon as
Exactly.
but in the before insert event, you can actually get that ID. Whereas with SQL Server, if your form is bound to a SQL Server table, then you're not going to get the new ID until the after update or the after insert.
Well, you're not going to be going to get the new idea until the record has been saved
Correct.
to SQL Server. That's the difference. One is dirty buffer and one is saved. You were
Mhm.
saying that, but I'm not sure that the way you said it came across as clearly as.
Will SSMA import access? All right. So when we've got links to our SQL Server tables, there's two main methodologies there we can use. We can use a DSN, which is an ODBC intermediary, or we can use DSN Less connections, where we just have the connection string to the SQL database, and we don't worry about the DSN. Can be either a file DSN that's portable or it's a system DSN. And personally, I've used the DSN Less connections, where you just have a connection string like this, as opposed to where you would just go DSN equals and the name of your DSN. But this is a DSN-less connection where we've got the server name, and one needs to be reminded sometimes that when SQL Server talks about the server, they actually mean the server and instance name. It's not just always the server name. As I alluded to before, if you've just used the default instance, then you can get away with this. Otherwise, you might need to specify the instance as well as the server name. And you can see there we've specified a driver. Okay, so here in our DSN, we can choose user DSN, a system DSN, or a file DSN. So if we're using a system DSN, we would go add, and it's going to be a SQL Server, and we've got a choice of drivers that we may want to use. If we use the bulk standard SQL Server driver, it's going to be slow as all get out. But so if we choose that, right, and then we name the server and we go through that process, which I'm not going to bother doing because it's pointless because I use DSN-less connections.
I know, Kent, that you mentioned that the SSMA tool is good for certain scenarios, but when you've got multiple databases that you want to import
No.
into a single SQL Server, I was thinking, could linking be done and would it be easy to do some linking at an access level to combine those databases and then import them, and then would those link tables, so you'd have a master access that would be linking to various access databases that are related. The master access database would then have link tables, and will they import in as if, regardless of whether they're linked or native tables? That's where I was trying to get to.
Yeah. Okay.
But if it's off topic, just don't worry about it.
Well,
Sorry.
the concept of trying to import multiple access databases into one SQL Server database gets a whole lot more complicated because
Right.
your primary keys need to change. When you're just inserting records from one access database into SQL Server, the migration assistant, as will actually queries in Access, will handle what's called identity inserts. Now in SQL
Yes.
Server, you can only set identity insert to true for one table at a time. Access queries will manage that for you. So when you use an append query, like this one here, right, SQL Server will allow you to insert that customer ID. Now, if you're importing from two different backend databases, you need to be able to create a new, and what I usually do is in the SQL Server table, I'll put a column where I've got the old ID and let SQL Server create the new ID. And then when I'm importing the child tables, I'll link from the child table to that old ID and then import in such a way that we create new IDs. That all gets a lot more complicated, and I think we might leave that for a whole other episode.
Okay. No, thanks, Kent. Sorry if I took us
No,
off
that's
topic.
right. That's a really good question, important, because if you're trying to merge multiple databases, it's not as simple as just using Migration Assistant or these standard queries. Crystal's put a little thing in the chat that tells you how to get the after you do the update in a record set, how to use the bookmark to get back to your last modified record and get its auto number. Yeah, that's one thing that you need to do is review all of your record set code and modify it to use DBC changes and get that value after the update. Sorry, trying to think of three things at once. All right, so what I do is, as you saw, I've built all those queries to do the inserts, and then I use code that just calls each append query, and the code calls them all in hierarchical order. Or when it's deleting the data, it goes backwards up the hierarchical order and deletes all the children before their parents. And so running that migrate process is just done using this code that calls the append queries. And then if I've got errors that are created by those bulk inserts, then I use this line insert where we iterate through all the records in the source table and call that same query to insert line by line until we get to the line that's throwing our error, and we can do some investigation. So that's the overview of what we do. So going back to our plan, hosting. Okay. Now, as I said, SQL Express, if you're using an Access database, then it's highly likely that SQL Express will do the job. And you can worry about going to a more expensive and complex licensing model later. You can use the developer edition, but only for development. And as I said, that should be kept quite separate from your production server instance. Now, getting IT involved in the process allows you to wash your hands of some of the issues that might come about due to, I don't know, stuff that I don't know about, Active Directory and things like that. I still tend to manage to some extent to make sure that we're getting backups, because with your staging environments, my applications are built in such a way that no one ever actually has to meddle directly into the production database. Not running scripts or anything like that. My front ends make any data structure changes. So the production database gets backed up and gets restored to test and development. So test and development have nice, fresh copies of the production data. And then the scripts that modify any data structures or whatever are run in development. And that all works all right, and that's totally automated. So when that gets put into test, that modifies the data structures in test. And at that point, we'll know if there's any failures before we then move the front end back into production. So the front end goes from dev to test to production, whereas the backup data goes from production to test to dev. The reason I've done this kind of overview is because a lot of people are going, well, I want to migrate to Access, from Access to SQL Server, but what's involved? Without a definitive list of all the things you've got to consider in your planning, it's highly likely you'll get halfway through and realize that you've screwed up, or you get to the end and you go, oh, I wish I'd done a bit more testing of this, or I wish I'd... And a lot of the work is in this section here, reviewing your data structures, your constraints, and your indexes. As we know, in Access, we've got a nice relationship window. And as we saw last month, Crystal gave us some code to document all of our relationships in Access. And I gave you some a view to show all your relationships in SQL Server. And it's a good time to get all those things right now and make sure you've got all the constraints you need and all your indexes are as they should be, even the ones that aren't visible in Access, like the ones that Access creates for foreign keys. In SQL Server, you've got to create your own. So it's one little thing you need to address there. And then have a good look at your constraints and talk them over with your client to make sure that you've got all the business rules covered. Obvious things that can be missed, like an invoice must have a customer. A invoice detail records must have an invoice ID. Things like that, which are not null constraints. Indexes in SQL Server work a little bit differently to Access, but the principles are still the same. Indexes belong to tables, and indexes can have one or more fields in them. In Access, you've got a property for an index to say ignore nulls. SQL Server doesn't have that, but it does have the ability to put a where clause on an index to say these two columns combined are unique, but ignore if this column's got a null in it. Has anybody come across issues with collation?
Yes, but I'm just trying to think back what it was. It caused some issue in a database that was 4 or 5 years old, and I just can't remember what it was. But
you're in a country where you speak a lot of French and what have you, so some of the collation would have require accents and things.
That's true. Yeah.
So not many people know about that until it gets to the point where they get bitten on the bum and they find that you can't just change it. You've got to empty your table out, change the collation and repopulate your table. And to have to do that with every table in your database can be quite painful. I mean, obviously it only applies to varchars, to text columns, not numeric columns, but that's one of the things you really want to get right to begin with. So I would say when you're first setting up your SQL Server, unless you've got a really good reason, have one default instance and only have one instance on your server, and make sure you get the collation right, because your databases are going to inherit that collation from the instance. The other thing to really be aware of when you are hosting SQL Server is it doesn't play nice with others. You can't put SQL Server on the same server that's trying to be your mail server. They don't play nice with each other. I've seen situations where we've had a server and it's all been running slow, and I moved SQL Server out onto its own PC and it all just went so much faster. And then the IT people came back and reconfigured it so that the virtual machine on the server that was running SQL had its own resources and everybody was happy.
And one thing, basically you were sort of touching on the fact that if you've got a poor Access database design, that's got to be fixed first. You've got to review that, looking for orphans, that kind of thing. And one thing I think is worth mentioning, some databases are obvious. If you're talking about orders and that, we probably all understand that. But there might be a phase where you need to speak to like if you're coming into this the first time, you don't know the database, it might be related to manufacturing, which you don't understand, or my example was irrigation. There might be a phase where you've got to speak to someone technical with the client, so you actually understand what the processes are, so you know what to look for in those orphans. So, for library application, we would understand it, and ordering we would understand, but there might be a little phase that you would have to include to have a talk with the technical people, so you know what the intended sort of operation of the database is and how processes are supposed to work. So you can identify those weaknesses within the design.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, you are going to need, in some cases, like some of these insert queries are going to fall over because you've got orphans and you've now created foreign keys that prevent orphans, and so you're going to need some queries that tell you what orphans you've got and what other things you've got to fix. What's the other main one? Orphans, and discussing the business rules with your client and reviewing the constraints and indexes accordingly is a big part of this, and that will take a lot of your time.
You were just talking about something, Kent, which is about restrictions of data. One thing I've noticed, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Access, you could have data that's already in tables which do not conform to the rules specified in the tables. Whereas I believe in SQL Server, if you try to put data in which doesn't conform to the tables, even if you take the constraints away, put the data in and then add them afterwards, it will complain. Is that right?
Okay, so we're going to a philosophical argument here, and I would say we need to get the data right. But with SQL Server, for example, there is a hint called no check that will allow you to get away with murder on historical data.
Oh.
Yeah, so you can.
That's the same as Access works, essentially.
Yeah, I don't tell people about it because they'll just want to bang the crap in and sweep it under the table and hope everyone forgets about it. But I like to actually enforce my constraints at this migration point and get things fixed so I don't have dodgy data. The problem with having the dodgy data is that you'll get weird behaviors. So it's a good idea to fix things like that. So any varchar column that has a not null constraint, I also put a check constraint to say it can't be a zero length string.
Yeah, I do. I've in my very limited use of SQL Server, I've tended to do that as well.
But people will find all sorts of ways of getting around constraints.
One other aspect when we talk about tidying up the data, we talk about indexes and nulls. The other one, it might be a good time to review normalisation.
I love what you've done today, Kent. It's punchy. It's a brilliant start. This isn't, this is how you do everything, but these are the things to consider. Put them in the right order. You might want to be flexible and change orders, whatever, but generally speaking, all the points are there, and they're punch. How am I trying to say this? They're punch points. These are the ones you've really got to get sorted. You've got to understand all of these items. You can play around with bits, but this is a great reference. This is a great reference of what you need to know and understand when you're thinking about migrating to SQL Server.
And it's a good checklist to give to your client to say, these are all the things we've got to do. And that's why it's going to take me more than half an hour to run SSMA.
Yeah, that was behind the comment I made in your email today. You have to manage your client's expectations ahead of time, because they're going to look at an Access database and say, well, gee, how long will it take you to copy that over? Half an hour? And when you come back with a 20-hour migration plan or however long, you have to make sure they understand it's more than just the final step of copying the data that has to go into it. And if you have this plan to give them and talk them through each of the things that you're going to actually implement, it goes a long ways towards managing a good relationship with that customer.
One thing that isn't even really covered in detail is the amount of work it takes actually to do the data migration. It says it's got to be repeatable, which is fine, but that means you've got to build up loads and loads of scripts.
If you've got a greenfield project where you can name everything nicely, you can actually just put a list of all your entities into a table and put an order on that table, and you just run down that. And a lot of the queries are exactly the same with just a change to the entity name. And it can be really quite simple. But generally, when you're inheriting an Access application, the naming conventions are all over the shop, and it's not going to be that easy.
Something I noticed earlier, Ken, which I think I noticed properly, you've got bulk updates, bulk transfers, and you've got line by line transfers.
Yep.
Now, would I be right in understanding that your line by line transfers is just code using the bulk transfers, but going through it in a way that makes sense to that code?
Well, yes, that's exactly what happens. And you go through line by line to find the record that's causing your bulk transaction to fall over.
Yeah, but you're not having a query for bulk update and then a separate query for single line update. You're taking
Same query, just called line by line.
bit of code. Yeah, bit of code that does it line by line.
And that your line by line code, because it's using the same query, if you get through doing every line by line, then the bulk query is going to work. So in this database that I'm happy for anyone to have, we've got connections to the SQL Server database, and you notice the DBO underscore on the front, and the Access database that doesn't have the DBO underscore, so that when the migration's complete, we do away with our connections to the Access tables, and we do away with the DBO underscore prefix, and we're off and running. Right, so here we've got the process. We can list all our tables from Access, and we can view them. So SQL Server will run our append query, migrate all. If that fails, then we revert to the line insert, and we've got a reset that deletes all the data out of all the SQL Server tables, and one that says migrate all. And when we can hit reset and then migrate all, and it all just happens like that, we're ready to go.
I would say this is pretty solid, Kent.
The methodology works. Yep. And Migration Assistant has certainly improved a lot, but it doesn't do everything. There's still little issues that need to be resolved. George, were you saying that it doesn't migrate the hidden indexes on foreign keys?
That's correct.
Why don't we ask the Access team to unhide those indexes? Because that's couldn't be too.
There are two solutions. Actually, there are three solutions that I see. One would be to unhide them. Well, are there any other cases where you can have a hidden index? Does anybody know?
Not that I know.
The other option that I would want to see is just to have a flag in SSMA that says migrate or don't migrate. Give the user, alert them. That's the real problem, is that SSMA simply ignores them. It came up in the first place. It was with Pat Hartman was trying to do a migration. She had identified all the indexes on all of her tables, and SSMA was coming up with a different number of indexes. And after thrashing for a while, we finally figured out that that's what was happening.
Yes. In fact, I was illuminated by this by Pat. Oh, and that raises another very important thing when you're doing a migration. How do you know if your migration was successful? The simple answer is if the destination table has the same number of records as the origin table, you've probably got it right.
But do you not have errors when a process runs that transfers the data?
Well, I do. That's why we go through the line by line thing to find out what's causing the error. And we fix, I tend to fix the data in the source. And if there is an obvious thing where that source data has either recent or historical, so you fix the historical, and if there's no recent, then you probably can say that the application isn't still creating bad data. But if you're getting recent problems, then you need to have a look at why the application's producing bad data and deal with that. So when you run that migrate all, you shouldn't get any errors. And that's because you fixed the source data.
Another method might be to run a report, say on last month's sales at the end of and if the reports tie, you know you've got the right data and the right values in all your data.
Well, yes. And that's the sort of thing I leave for the client to do in their testing. So when they're testing, because you want the client to test the migrated solution and compare to the reports that they're getting out of their current. But clients usually know what to look for in that data better than you do. So doing a record count, I think, is a nice little check at the end to say, yep, that looks good.
All of this talk just reminded me of another validation check that I liked to run when I was doing this. Okay, one of the things that Access does is tolerate date-like values in date fields. Values that are things like 1107 in a date table.
Yeah, well, people transpose the day and the year, or the month
And the year and the month. And there were just a bunch of lousy data. So if I had simply counted the records, I would not have found those data anomalies.
So
And
there
this
are
is
some of those anomalies you will
Yeah.
catch because it will throw an error because SQL Server doesn't like the date that's input. But in some of them where you've just transposed,
what I did in that case, which reminded me is simply do a sort, first oldest to newest, newest to oldest. On that.
yes.
And it popped all of the anomalies to the top.
So here you've got my little check queries. And one of the things is where the date's greater than now, or the date's less than the year 2000. So there I've got a valid date range. And that's something that you can work with your clients to say, okay, what are your valid dates for invoices? Yeah. So I do tend to create these CHK queries that are validating data, because not everyone's got proper data validation in their Access backends. As I said before, you can actually apply check constraints with the no check hint, but I don't like doing it.
I think one little nugget that I'd just like to come back to that Kent mentioned was getting the client involved in the validation or the checking at the end. I think that's really, really important because they should know what they're looking for. They might know the kind of curliest situations where there's something's likely to go wrong, and then there's also liability issues. You know, it's not just us telling the client it's right. We're asking them to tell us the issues and that. I think that's really important.
That's a very good point. This is one of the things when I'm working on a project, right? I tend not to ever release a front end directly into production. I always give it to the client project manager, whose job is to test it and then put it into production. And that way we're sharing responsibility. This next month, we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into the differences between Access and SQL Server data types and how to map between the two when we're doing a migration. So I hope to see you then. Bye for now.